He sat quietly at the corner of the break room, same worn thermos in hand, the same tired eyes that had seen more than any of them would ever know. To his younger coworkers, he was just Rick, the old maintenance guy, slow-moving and stuck in his ways. Whispers floated around the company wanted someone younger, cheaper, faster. His name was already on the chopping block. But what no one knew was that this quiet man had once walked through hell and back. Long before he was sweeping floors and fixing broken lights, Rick had led men through enemy fire. He had carried wounded soldiers on his back while bullets rained from the sky. He had made a vow, never leave a man behind. And just as the HR rep printed his termination notice, a sharply dressed visitor stepped into the lobby. A Navy officer with medals on his chest and a story to tell. He glanced across the room and froze. Because there, sitting with that same worn thermos, was the man who had saved his life on a battlefield decades ago. And in that instant, everything changed. Rick Dawson had worked at the same manufacturing plant for nearly 19 years. He was the man who showed up before sunrise and left long after the last whistle blew. No one had ever seen him take a sick day. He moved slower than most now, his back stiff from years of heavy lifting and a war no one asked him about. To the newer employees, he was part of the background, a quiet, gray-haired janitor with calloused hands and kind eyes. But to Rick, this job wasn't just a paycheck. It was structure, routine, a way to stay grounded. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was deep and calm. He always greeted the security guard by name, always helped the newer guys without complaint. But in the break room, behind his back, whispers began to circulate. He's slowing down. We need younger hands, more energy. Why's he still here? The company had brought in new management men with sharp suits, sharper tongues, and colder hearts. Their eyes were fixed on numbers, not names. And Rick's salary, though modest, now stood out on a spreadsheet. He was 64. Too old, they said. Too slow. Too expensive. What they didn't know was that Rick had once been Sergeant Dawson of the U.S. Navy, a battlefield technician during one of the bloodiest deployments of the Iraq War. But that uniform, that chapter, was hidden in a drawer under a stack of yellowed letters and faded photographs. Rick never talked about the war. He had seen too much. Lost too many. There were nights when the sound of clanging tools reminded him of distant explosions, when a dropped wrench would make him flinch. But he never told anyone. He'd made a promise to himself when he returned home. Don't burden others with ghosts they can't see. And so he swept the floors, fixed the broken pipes, and smiled politely when no one remembered his birthday. Then the rumors started becoming meetings. HR huddled behind closed doors, looking over performance, reviews, and age statistics. They decided Rick would be transitioned out. A younger replacement had already been lined up, a former intern fresh out of school. They just needed the final sign-off. Meanwhile, Rick worked like he always had. He didn't know he had just a week left out until that Monday morning. It was a day like any other. Rick was polishing the floor near the main lobby, the soft hum of the buffer echoing against the glass walls. Outside, a black SUV pulled up, and a man stepped out, a tall Navy officer in full dress uniform, ribbons gleaming against deep navy blue. The receptionist straightened, employees paused. His presence wasn't ordinary. The officer asked for the plant manager. His voice was steady, but his eyes scanned the room like he was searching for something or someone. Rick didn't look up. He was too focused on a scuff mark that wouldn't come out. But then the officer froze. His breath caught. His face paled. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on Rick, who finally stood and turned to grab his thermos. The officer spoke, almost a whisper. "Sergeant Dawson?" Rick turned slowly, confused. "Yes." There was a pause. A long one. as if the weight of 1,000 memories was hanging between them. Then, with emotion swelling in his voice, the officer said, "You saved my life. Fallujah, 2004. You pulled me out of the Humvee when it was burning." Rick stared at him. The name tag on the man's chest read LT, Commander T.J. Merritt. Rick blinked once, twice, and then a flicker of memory smoke, screams, fire, a wounded young sailor trapped under twisted metal. The face, now lined with rank and age, had once been bloodied and terrified. Rick's voice cracked. "You were just a kid, and you were the reason I made it home." The lobby was silent, eyes turned. Whispers began again, but now they were filled with awe, not judgment. Rick didn't say anything. He just nodded quietly. But something had shifted. This wasn't just a man who swept floors anymore. This was a man who had risked his life in the heat of battle not once, but again and again. An unsung hero hiding in plain sight. LT. Commander Merritt didn't come by accident. He was there for a scheduled military tribute and award presentation to the company for hiring veterans. But now he had found something even more important, a forgotten hero who never asked for recognition. And he was about to make sure everyone in that building knew who Rick Dawson really was. Rick had always believed that some stories are better left on the battlefield. He carried his war memories like shrapnel buried deep, sharp enough to sting if touched. After returning from Iraq in 2005, he locked away the uniform, the medals, and the memories. In his mind, the real heroes never made it back. But now, after nearly 2 decades of silence, the war had followed him back into a place he never expected, a factory lobby, with the Navy officers standing tall and teary-eyed in front of him. By the time LT. Commander T.J. Merritt walked into the manager's office to request a meeting, whispers had already started turning into questions. Who was Rick Dawson? What happened in Fallujah? The manager, a younger man named Clark, looked stunned. "You know him?" Merritt sat down, removed his officer's cap, and nodded. "I don't just know him. I owe my life to him." And with that, the story began to unfold, one the company had never heard and Rick had never intended to share. Fallujah, Iraq, October 2004. Rick had been a Navy construction battalion technician, part of a support convoy moving through the outskirts of Fallujah when insurgents opened fire. The ambush was brutal. Rocket-propelled grenades struck 2 vehicles, and a Humvee carrying a young Navy medic named Merritt was engulfed in flames. Rick's unit was hit hard, and chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked overhead. Smoke clouded vision. Screams pierced the air. Most men dropped to cover, waiting for support. But Rick didn't hesitate. He ran straight into the fire, Merritt recounted. "Didn't think twice. He didn't even know my name. I was just another soldier pinned under wreckage." Rick managed to pull open the jammed door. Flames licked the seats. Ammunition began to pop from the heat. But with bare hands, Rick reached in, grabbed Merritt by his vest, and dragged him through the fire and sand to safety. Seconds later, the Humvee exploded. It was a miracle we made it out. "But Rick, he didn't stop there," Merritt said, voice shaking. "He went back twice. Pulled out 2 more guys before the air support arrived." That day earned Rick a Navy Commendation Medal for heroic acts under fire, but he declined public ceremony. Instead, he asked to have it mailed home, tucked it away, and left the military 2 years later carrying the trauma, but not the spotlight. Backup? In the present, Rick returned to his workbench, unaware of what was happening behind closed doors. LT. Commander Merritt called an impromptu staff gathering. The plant's employees were puzzled at first. Most assumed it was a corporate presentation. But when the Navy officers stood before them and pointed to Rick Dawson, still in his oil-stained coveralls, the room fell into reverent silence. "This man," Merritt began, is not just a maintenance worker. He is a soldier, a savior, a man who taught me what battlefield courage truly looks like." Rick stood frozen. Dozens of eyes turned to him, many that had once looked through him. He never asked for recognition, never spoke a word about the war. That's humility. That's honor. And that's what a real war hero looks like. The room erupted in applause. Not polite clapping, but a thunderous, emotional tribute. Some wiped their eyes. Others stepped forward to shake his hand. And Rick simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Later that evening, Merritt sat with Rick in the break room, the same one where people used to whisper about his age. They talked for hours. Rick spoke slowly at first, like unlocking an old door. He spoke of friends he'd lost, of carrying the weight of decisions no one back home would understand, of the guilt of surviving, of nights when he couldn't sleep because the desert never truly left him. And Merritt listened not as a Navy officer, but as a brother in arms, a man who finally had a chance to say thank you. "You didn't just save me, Rick, you gave me the life I live today. My kids, my wife, my career. They're all because of you." Rick wiped his eyes. "I didn't do anything special. You did everything that mattered." The next day, the HR department quietly shredded the termination letter, not because of guilt, but out of deep, newfound respect. The same young manager who once saw Rick as expendable now saw him as irreplaceable. Word spread quickly through the company. Then the town. A local newspaper ran a story under the headline, "Forgotten Hero Found in Factory Halls." What followed was unexpected. Veterans in the community came forward. Some had worked quietly like Rick, others had struggled alone. Inspired by Rick's story, the company created a veteran recognition program honoring unsung heroes in their workforce. Rick didn't want attention, but what he got in the end was something he hadn't felt in years: appreciation, understanding, brotherhood. And for the first time in 2 decades, he pulled his Navy medal out of the drawer and placed it on the shelf above his workbench, not for others to see, but so he could finally believe it himself. After that unforgettable day in the factory lobby, Rick Dawson became something he never intended. A symbol of silent strength, not because he sought it, not because he asked for it, but because his story one of sacrifice, humility, and forgotten. Heroism resonated in a way that cut through corporate walls and reached something deeper in people. What began as a simple tribute from Lt. Commander Merritt became a ripple of honor. The plant's employees, many of whom had once overlooked Rick, entirely now greeted him differently, no longer with awkward politeness, but with real respect. Some even began eating lunch near him in the break room, asking questions they'd never dared ask before. One young technician, Marcus, barely 22, finally found the courage to speak up. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," he said, eyes flickering with hesitation. "But he never talked about it. I think he was like you." Rick looked at him for a long moment, then nodded gently. "Yeah, we were trained to carry the load, not pass it around." It was a simple sentence, but for Marcus, it struck something raw. That night, he called his grandfather for the first time in months. Across the town, news of Rick's story spread, thanks to the local newspaper and a heartfelt blog post written by Merritt himself, titled, "The Man Who Carried Me Out of Hell is Still Carrying Others." It was shared thousands of times. Suddenly, veterans from all corners of the region began writing in emails, handwritten letters. Some simply said, "Thank you, Rick, for reminding people we're still here." Others shared stories they had never told anyone else. Wounds long hidden now felt a little less heavy. Even a local high school invited Rick to speak at their Veterans Day assembly. He tried to decline, but Merritt, with a half smile, nudged him. "They don't need a speech, Rick, just a story." yours. So, with trembling hands, Rick stood before 400 teenagers in a school auditorium, dressed not in uniform, but in the same blue work shirt he'd worn for years, patched at the shoulder and stained with oil. He looked out into the crowd, young faces full of energy and distractions, and cleared his throat. "I wasn't a hero," he began, voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared every single day, but I had a job to do. And that job was to make sure the guy next to me made it home." He paused, silence stretched. "That's what courage looks like. It's not medals, it's not parades. It's looking at chaos, feeling the fear, and still going forward for someone else." By the end, half the teachers were crying, and even the students accustomed to quick content and short attention spans stood and applauded. Back at the plant, something remarkable was happening. Behind the scenes, inspired by Rick's humility and battlefield courage, the company partnered with a local veterans organization to start a Forgotten Heroes initiative. It focused on finding, hiring, and supporting veterans who had quietly returned from service, often with no roadmap and no support system. They named the program after Rick, Dawson Duty. It offered job training, mental health support, and mentorship, and Rick, though hesitant, agreed to be part of it. He didn't want a title, just a seat at the table. "I know what it's like to come back and feel invisible," he said during one of the early meetings. "If I can help one soldier feel seen, then it's worth it." For the first time in years, Rick wasn't just showing up to work, he was showing up with purpose. He began mentoring 2 younger veterans who had recently joined the maintenance crew. One had served in Afghanistan and struggled with PTSD. Other had trouble adapting to civilian life and often kept to himself. Rick never forced stories. He never asked questions. He simply worked beside them, day after day, wordlessly showing them that it was okay to move slow, to breathe, to speak, or not. That brotherhood didn't end with the discharge papers. It only changed shape. Then came the surprise Rick never saw coming. On a rainy Thursday morning, the plant called for another staff gathering. Rick assumed it was routine, but when he walked into the room, he saw a familiar face standing at the front. Rear Admiral Cynthia Ross. She had served in the Navy with Rick, though at the time they had only crossed paths during supply runs. Now, decades later, she stood before him in full uniform, holding a small velvet box. She smiled. "Sergeant Dawson, for your extraordinary acts of bravery, for your silent strength, and for the lives you've changed without ever seeking thanks, it is my honor to present you with the Navy Distinguished Service Medal." Rick's knees nearly buckled. The room erupted with emotion cheers, tears, and a standing ovation that lasted minutes. Rick, with eyes misted and hands trembling, accepted the medal. He said only one thing: "I didn't do it for the recognition. I did it because it was right." That night, Rick returned home and sat on his porch in silence. He didn't feel like a hero. He never had. But for the first time in a long time, he felt understood. Seen. He looked up at the stars clear and sharp in the night sky and whispered the names of the men he'd lost, one by one, as he always had, but this time there was something different in his voice. Pride. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Rick Dawson became more than a symbol. He became a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, and that the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest stories. But Rick never let the spotlight change him. He still clocked in early, still cleaned the same hallways, still took lunch at 12:15 with his old thermos and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. But now the seat beside him was rarely empty. The 2 young veterans he mentored, Jorge and Malik, began to thrive. Jorge started therapy for the first time in 5 years. Malik, once distant and withdrawn, organized a fundraiser for a fellow veteran who'd lost his home. They told anyone who asked that Rick wasn't just their mentor, he was their anchor. And still, Rick stayed humble. "Don't put me on a pedestal," he'd say. "I just did what any of us would have done." But those around him knew better. They saw a man who had lived the kind of courage most people only read about. A man who never demanded respect, but earned it in every quiet act of service. A man who had given everything on the battlefield, and still gave more when he came home. One late evening, just before closing, Rick stood alone in the workshop. The lights were dim, the factory hushed, machinery asleep for the night. He was packing up when a hand tapped his shoulder. "It was Merritt. I wanted to give you something," he said, holding out a small framed photograph. Rick took it in his hands. His breath caught. It was an old, grainy photo from Iraq the day after the ambush. Rick, dust-covered and exhausted, stood in the background while medics worked on a wounded Merritt in the foreground. The caption below read, "The man who walked into fire for a stranger." Rick chuckled softly. "Didn't know anyone snapped that." "I found it in my deployment journal," Merritt said. "I figured it should be with you." Rick stared at it a long time before placing it gently into his locker. "Thank you, son." A few months later, on Veterans Day, the factory held a public ceremony honoring its veteran employees. Hundreds showed up. News crews arrived. Former service members gathered with their families. But the seat reserved for Rick Dawson sat empty. He hadn't come to the ceremony. Worried, Merritt and a few workers drove to his small home just outside town. There, on the porch, in his favorite chair, sat Rick, his hat pulled low, a soft smile on his face, and his hands resting peacefully in his lap. Rick Dawson had passed away in his sleep. The man who had survived battlefields, buried brothers, and rebuilt his life with quiet grace was gone. The funeral was unlike any the town had ever seen. Hundreds came, veterans from every era, factory workers in uniform, young men and women who had never met Rick but had read about him. The governor sent a letter. A Navy flyover honored his service, and Merritt gave the eulogy. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Some men fight wars, then come home and disappear." Rick never asked to be remembered, but he will be. Not just for what he did in Iraq, but for what he did here. For being the kind of man who made others better, even when no one noticed. He taught us that heroism is not just found in battle, but in how we treat people when the war is over. Rick Dawson didn't need medals to be great. He just needed a mop, a toolbox, and a heart big enough to carry us all. When the final salute was fired and the flag folded, Merritt stepped forward. He placed it into Rick's old thermos, the same one he'd brought to work every day. And on his tombstone, 5 simple words were carved beneath his name. He never left a man behind. Years later, a new generation of workers would walk the halls of that same factory. Some would see Rick's picture on the memorial wall, others would hear his name during training sessions. Few would ever fully grasp what he had endured, but every November, veterans and civilians alike would gather at the Dawson duty bench outside the building, a place of quiet reflection, built in his honor. Beneath it, a plaque read, "In memory of Rick Dawson, worker, warrior, and friend." A real war hero and one of the forgotten heroes who taught us how to remember. Jorge eventually became a supervisor. Malik opened a small counseling center for veterans. Both credited Rick for changing their lives. And Merritt? He left the Navy with honors and began writing full-time, telling stories of unsung heroes like Rick. His first book was titled The Quietest Soldier. The dedication simply read, "For Sergeant Rick Dawson, who never stopped serving. In the end." Rick Dawson wasn't just saved from being fired. He saved a legacy that would outlive him. Legacy that reminded us all that sometimes the greatest heroic acts happen not with fanfare, but with humility. Not on the battlefield, but in the break room. And not for glory, but for love of one another,